Welcome back, everybody, to the C Show. Got your boy Chris here. I got a very special guest here with me today, Miss Lee. She is an amazing lady. She has a Facebook group called Stories of the United States Colored Troops. So, Miss Lee, what caught your attention about that, or got you to want to get involved to tell the story?
Well, I've actually been involved probably for about 25 or 30 years. I did a lot of local presentations in North Carolina, a couple in Virginia, South Carolina, and I knew that the story needed to be told by the responses that I got from the people who were attending my presentations. They were pretty much in awe because so many didn't know about the United States Colored Troops. And that's when I decided, let's try and start a Facebook group and see where we can go with this.
I mean, because growing up in high school and it's never touched on. I mean, we never hear, and when they taught it American history, maybe a vague mention of it.
Oh, I didn't hear it in high school. I didn't really hear it in college. And even though my husband was a history major in college, they barely touched on the United States Colored Troops. Most of the information he didn't know. So my interest actually began when I was in college and I was doing a paper for a history professor. I went to the library to get the book that I needed to do my research. And when I pulled it off of the shelf, the book next to it fell. So I picked it up and put it back on the shelf, and it fell again. And when I picked it up the second time, the title caught my eye, and it was called Army Life in a Black Regiment. My natural assumption was that, okay, this is probably World War II, Korea, maybe World War I. And I opened it up and just kind of flipped through it a little bit. And about halfway down the paragraph, I realized this is about the Civil War. And before I realized it, I had been standing in that aisle in the library for 20 minutes reading that book. So I finally checked it out, took it home, read the entire book in 2 days. It was by Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was the commander of the 1st South Carolina. And that really sparked an interest. It was my last year of college, and the last semester of my history class, and I had taken on such an interest that I asked my professor if he would allow me to do independent study on the United States Colored Troops as a research project instead of taking the normal next 8 weeks of classes. And he said, you do realize your senior grade is going to depend on what you do in this research. I said, yes, I'm well aware of that. I said, I intend to dig deep. And I did. I think probably a 25, 26 paper research paper, got an A on it. And then that really sparked my interest in learning more. So this was long before there was an internet. I would actually search antique bookstores trying to find research on them. And I found a couple actually on the West Coast that had a good selection of United States Colored Troops books. So back then, it was not like Amazon, you just go and order the book and click it. I would actually have to write to the bookstore, ask them what they had. They would send me a list back of what they had. I would make my selection, send them a check, wait for the check to clear, then wait for them to send it to me in the mail. So the whole process might take about 2 weeks just to get a book. But now my collection has grown to probably, 50 or 60 books just on the United States Colored Troops.
Well, see, with the group that I had, the Killer Angels, and, focusing, sometimes it gets hard because, people want to go off on all the political reasons and keep people focused on the military aspect. I looked so hard to find a group about the United States Colored Troops. And when I finally found yours, like, well, I have not found this before, because I try to honor anybody, the natives, the Irish, females, anybody who participated in the war. But since I found your group, I've came across, so many interesting stories that I've never heard before. The 1st Alabama Cavalry Unit was a United States Colored Troop unit that I found out about. And it's just a phenomenal group that everybody needs to get into. I mean, the first time I ever heard anything about it was when I watched the movie Glory, and I was 13 or 14. I had no idea.
The movie Glory was probably the one thing in American television history that really sparked the interest in the United States Color Troops, because like you said, so many people didn't know, had no idea that blacks had even fought in the Civil War. And the movie Glory, even with all of its inaccuracies, it really brought to the attention of the American public how much and how many of the United States Color Troops participated in the Civil War. So it really kind of snowballed after that, and people started to take an interest. Young black men started to decide to work and serve as reenactors and living history interpreters, and become part of the National Park Service interpretation group. And that's when it really took off. My group, I really never expected it to grow as quickly as it has, but I started the group about 4.5 years ago, and I'm averaging an increase of 1,000 members per year. So I am very happy with the progress that I've made.
That's very impressive. I mean, you have so much great information there. I mean, stories from families that's going off, and I mean, I just love it. I love the group. I learn something new in there every day that I never heard of. Until I'd read, I always forget his name, but the Sergeant Major, the first one who became the Medal of Honor recipient.
That would be Christian Fleetwood.
Too, and I think about that. Like I say, I couldn't explain the word for it. I mean, here's a man that really didn't belong to a country, but he refused to let the flag touch the ground. I mean, kids today just they don't have that type of pride, or I mean, what am I looking for? I mean,
or that would be William Carney, the one that you're speaking of, and he was with the 54th. He was with the 54th, and you're right. And I think perhaps they came from a different mindset. Their mindset was to become part of a country, to gain that freedom and to acclimate into the country. It's the only country they knew, even though many of them were not born here, but transported here to be enslaved people. They wanted to be part of the only country that they'd known. They didn't really know anything about Africa.
And they didn't get treated right. I mean, by, in the Northern Army, they got paid less than what their counterparts did.
They did.
And they was treated, with racism in the North. I mean, it's just amazing that the respect I have for him is just amazing that the man refused to. I don't know. I just don't know how you could what you use to describe that.
And he wasn't the only one. I mean, there were several members of the United States Color Troops who were recipients of the Medal of Honor, and they all had the same basic characteristics. They did whatever they needed to do to protect their regiment, to protect their brothers who were near them, to protect themselves, and most of all to protect the flag that they were carrying, because it stood for so much for them. It stood for freedom and equality, and it stood for actually them, how can I put this, from the term of becoming a boy, a slave, to becoming a man.
Good analogy or observation, way to put that. I mean, because people talk about, as far as Southerners, Northerners, nobody can really say what was in each man was fighting for different reasons, but there's no doubt what the United States Color Troops were fighting for. I mean, there can be no doubt about that. And I wasn't aware that there was actually black officers. I thought they were not allowed. And I think DC Overby told me there was like 100 and something black officers.
There
was
were,
that true?
if I remember correctly, I think the number was 112. And probably the first black officer that comes to mind was Captain Andre Collot from Louisiana. And I have a personal connection to him. My great-grandmother, who lived to be 100, born in 1859 before the Civil War began, and died in 1959 when I was 7. grew up in the same neighborhood as Andrew Clubb. And her brother, Lieutenant Charles Bannister, actually served with him at Port Hudson. So they were still a state militia at that time. It was the Louisiana Native Guards, but he was the first officer that I know of to serve in a Black regiment. Once the regiments were established in January of 1863, it probably took a good 6 months before officers realized that, okay, we do have Blacks that can serve in that capacity. We do have Blacks who can read and write and fill out tri-monthly reports. And so many of them served not only as officers, but as NCOs. They felt a deep responsibility, not only toward their men, but toward their superiors, their officers, in making sure they got it right and did it right.
Now, you mentioned that Louisiana regiment, and I've heard different stories. Is it true that there was a unit in Louisiana that was a Black unit that tried to offer their services to the Confederacy at the beginning of the war, and they were rejected?
That was the first Louisiana Native Guard. And how that story came about, and it's not a story, it is a fact, but you have to remember, you have to put yourself in the date and time of their lives. There was no internet, no television, no radio, very few newspapers. All they were hearing was the same thing that their white neighbors were hearing. The Yankees are coming to invade the South, and they're going to take everything you have. Now, you have to remember, the first Louisiana Native Guards were not slaves. My great-grandmother was a teacher in New Orleans. Her brother was very well educated, as she was. So most of the members of the Louisiana Native Guard, the 1st Regiment, were actually teachers and farmers and ministers and owned small Black businesses. They were doing the same thing that their white counterparts in Louisiana were trying to do. They were simply trying to protect what they had worked to accumulate, everything they had gained. So their whole point was to join their neighbors and to fight for what they had. But they didn't understand the whole precept and the concept behind the war. And when they offered their services to the Confederacy, it was immediately refused. So even though they organized as a Confederate unit, they were never used nor never served as a Confederate unit. When the city of New Orleans fell in 1862 under General Butler, that's when they offered their services to the Union and became known as the 1st Louisiana Native Guards, and eventually reorganized as a federal unit and became the 73rd USCT.
Guys in one of my groups, he loves Civil War, Black gentleman, comments all the time. He said his great-great-grandfather, that shows you how many generations, it's really not that long ago. Like, I'm 44. My grandfather was born in 1930, and his daddy, which would be my great-grandfather, was born in 1870. Well, I've tracked it back to my great-great-great-grandfather was in a unit, and that's where he settled, and that was his son. So I mean, you're only a couple generations away. But anyway, he's somebody that he worked in Virginia building fortifications, and he made a statement one time, and I listened to him, and he said, if the South had freed the slaves and promised 20 acres and a mule or whatever over here in your freedom, and he said, and armed them. I said, you believe they would have fought? He said, well, they would have seen the Northerners as invaders coming to take their land and coming to take what they had just given. Do you think that could have been a possibility if the Confederacy did that in 1861?
I think it might have been a possibility, but then I guess my first reaction would have been, why was I ever enslaved in the first place? And now all of a sudden you freed me. So I don't know that I would have actually looked at the Confederacy in the same way that my white counterpart may have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough call because, man, another of my good friends, William Satterwhite, we was talking about that one day because I brought this up and I said, it sounds good on paper. Hey, let's free and arm the slaves. Okay, so now we just armed 2 million men and put them up in her arms. And, you know, would you like to be the two guys that went on the plantation with 200 slaves? Because you know there's going to be that couple guys that are really, really smart and go, hey, they just armed us. Let's kill them and take all their stuff. And then we get, you know, then we got it and then we take over. I said, and William said, he said, I commend, you know, Davis, because Davis knew that if they did that, they would be looking at a big mess if something like that happened. And that's why when I said the only way it possibly could have happened had it been at the beginning of the war, by the time the war went on, you know, it would have never taken place. Yeah. And so I read, oh God, he was a representative from Alabama. He wrote a letter to James Seddon in 1863 trying to get Davis to free the slaves and to get England involved, because he said, look, you're going to lose them one way or another. So, or either that, you're going to lose your independence. So, you know, that's not, I've heard people debate that off and on. Personally, you know, maybe it could have worked. I don't know. I don't know how that would have played out.
True.
Now, another question I've got to ask you, I run into this all the time, and oh God, it just drives me crazy. Tell me about all the Black Confederate units.
What Black Confederate unit?
Well, I mean, you go on some of these websites. I mean, you'll if you listen to them, I mean, they had entire Confederate armies down there, 60, 70, 80,000 Black units.
You know, when Davis, like you said, when he wrote the Constitution of the Southern Confederacy, one of the precepts was that Blacks would not be permitted to use firearms. So, you know, if you think about it, if I've got a firearm, as you said, why am I going to fight the people who are trying to free me, as opposed to shooting the people who, if they win the war, I go back to the same condition that I was already in? So it doesn't make any sense to me, you know, why Blacks would fight for the Confederacy. Now, Blacks certainly served the Confederacy, but there is a distinct difference between serving in the Confederacy as opposed to serving the Confederacy. And they did serve it. They served it as Teamsters and body servants and cooks and transporters and all kinds of jobs that they had. And I'm not going to say 100% that there may not have been the rare occasion in that someone was shooting at them and someone didn't pick up a gun and fire back. But there were certainly no organized regiments of Blacks within the Confederacy.
I was, and before I go on that, say that that's what when people talk about Black, that's what I consider the Black Confederates, the ones who served as the Teamsters and who did that. And I'm one of the people who think that there needs to be some kind of honor paid to them for the sacrifice that they made. I don't know how I'm trying to put this, but for it to sound, I want to be able to sound right, but they was forced to work, and they should have some kind of recognition for what they did. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And as you said, it was not a voluntary assignment, that's for sure. You know, they simply did what they were told to do, but they obviously did it very well for the Confederacy to do as well as they did, because I don't think that they could have done it without that kind of support. That's for sure. So yes, you know, I agree that there should be some kind of recommendation, or not recommendation, but commendation, you know, for those who did serve, even though they had no choice in the matter.
Yeah, just to honor them, because you got to think about, if they did not have that, think about the manpower they would have taken away from soldiers to go over there and you know, I mean, because that freed up a lot of manpower for the Confederacy there. And I just don't think, you know, I think they should get their dues for, you know, what they did. But and the Black Confederate things, you know, I just laugh. I see it all the time, and I finally got to the point that I argue with people. I mean, and what you said a while ago, I remember reading a story one time that an encampment had been run over, and there were 10 or 15 Teamsters or whatever there, and some Confederate soldiers that actually picked up rifles to defend because they felt they was all going to be killed. So, I can't say between 1861 and 1865 a slave didn't pick up a rifle and fire.
Neither can I. Yeah, that's very true.
And so, we did have the moderator group. We're pretty close to the moderator. We had a conversation the other day about Black Confederates, and one of the guys said that there may have been, and he's just speculating, guys that were free and was light skinned enough that passed off as white that could have served. And I said, yeah, I mean, I guess that's possible. But I said, but as far as full slaves, I said, no, there were no regiments of that. And one of the I think it was at Manassas, one of the northern newspapers reported, 3 or 4 regiments of black soldiers. I'm like, wait a second, y'all are the same people that be screaming fake news.
That's very true. And conversely, there were probably some very fair-skinned blacks in the North who also served with white regiments, and also passed as white. So, that could have gone both ways.
I mean, the only way that I could see, and I just made this right here about Black Confederates, is if some of your cavalry officers, like Forrest or something, or people like that, they would have 5 or 6, their slaves with them, and I could see them being armed. Do you consider that a Black Confederate soldier? I mean, I don't know. I mean, he was riding with them, but that, maybe a bodyguard. But as far as I get so sick of that argument. But I laugh at people all the time when they bring it up. And I got kicked out of several Black Confederate unit groups for calling them out on it, but.
I try to stay away from them.
A few years ago, I was in one, and they had a guy named Louis Winton, and said he was he served in some kind of Mississippi unit and in a cavalry unit, and he became a captain at age 20, and he was born a slave. I thought, that's kind of young to be a captain. So I looked him up, and he was born a slave. His father was white, and he was born a slave. He had a very successful life after the war. He was a judge. He was a marshal. He owned a business. Did very well for himself. Mentioned nothing about him being in the war. So I keep digging, and I keep digging, and I keep digging, and I start going through census reports and everything that's right here. And it took me about 2 hours, and I finally found it. Louis Winton, the slave, was born in 1844. Captain Louis Winton, born in the same county, a white man born in 1820, was the captain. And they have an entire Facebook page passing off this lie.
And that frequently happens because, slaves were given no choice really in their last name. So if he had been a slave on that plantation, he may have come from another plantation where his last name may have been Smith. And as soon as he was sold, his last name automatically became Winton or Hinton. So, there's altogether possible that they did have the last name and he just simply adopted this other man's biography.
And I don't know whether you think it's the hardcore lost cause that try to justify the war by saying we had these Black Confederates fighting and for us. That's the only thing I can think of. They're trying to justify it. Because when you read the Cornerstone speeches and, and even at the end, they raised what, legend has it 2 companies, but that's the only thing I can think of is that they went so lost cause that, they had Black Confederates fighting for them. And it's just not, it just didn't happen.
No.
And do you have an opinion on it? You think that's what they're trying to do to justify it? I mean,
Well, I think
See,
they're probably trying to justify it, but if you sit down and really think about it, why would I go to war against the same circumstances that I'm going to fall right back into as soon as the war is over? Because if they do win the war and this does become a separate country, slavery is not going away. So no.
And here's what I've said. And when these people start coming out and start saying, oh, the war wasn't about slavery. Well, okay, to the Southern aristocracies, it was. To the people who felt they were being invaded, it was poor. It's a totally different thing. But what I said is, look, own it. Okay, the slave industry or whatever, that was worth $22 trillion to the Southern economy. Just own it. You're damn right. They was not giving that up without going to war. I mean, there's no way. That was in today's money. You think they were giving $22 trillion up without going to war?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So, when people give this, and they will say, calls me a lost cause person, I'm like, well, look, I said, if I'm going back looking at this in 1860 eyes, and because in 2021, I couldn't imagine doing that. But if you sit back and you look at 1860 eyes, and you've got a plantation with 200 slaves, and you own 100 acres, and you're worth, $3.9 million in today's, you think you're giving that up without a fight? No. So, by that sense, I understand what the Confederacy government was doing. They was trying to protect their economic interests, even though it was human bondage, which is wrong. I mean, I understand what they were going through. I understand why they were doing what they were doing. I hope that doesn't sound bad, but I understand.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it was about slavery, which in turn led to economics. So certainly that's what it was about. But the core principle of the entire war was based on slavery. Now, you can look at it from a philosophical standpoint, or you can look at it from an economic standpoint. But either way, it was about slavery.
I mean, I'm looking at it from an economic standpoint. I mean, that, just from trying to put it in perspective, from my point of view, if I'm sitting here, we're an aristocracy, we've got all this kind of money, I'm not giving that, they're going to have to come get it. I mean, nobody's just going to give that up. I mean, I think and this right here, I was explaining this to somebody the other day, and I don't know if, I think as the war went on, by no doubt about it, by 18, when the war started, South, slavery. But I think as the war went on, and after the Emancipation Proclamation, it became slavery became more of a northern aim. In the South, they had already lost most of their plantations, and by the end of the war, it became more they was wanting to maintain their independence. I mean, because they had nothing left. I mean, everything was destroyed. I mean, when Lee abandoned the trenches at Petersburg, I doubt the last thing on his mind was, hey, we got to hurry so we can keep our slaves. I think that at that point, they had already given up. And I know a lot of they still had hope, but I think by that point, their aim was for survival, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's a fair assessment or not, but that was just what I've always kind of thought.
I think it is a fair assessment. It reminds me of a line from the movie Gettysburg, and Joshua Chamberlain's brother, Thomas, asked a Confederate soldier who had been captured, why are you fighting? And he said, we're fighting for our rats. And I think that basically toward the end of the war, that was very true. I mean, they were really fighting for whatever they had left. And you have to remember, 80% of Confederates in the war didn't own slaves. They were almost as poor as slaves. So they really were fighting toward the end of the war to hang on to whatever they had left.
And it's amazing how they convinced, this rich Southern aristocracies convinced these dirt poor farm boys they were fighting for their rights. And, what rights? you don't own slaves. What rights are you fighting for? But I mean, none of these boys were not smart and couldn't read, and but they convinced them, and to go do this. And some of them, like say, I love the story about at Shiloh at Shelby Foote and Union soldier and Confederate soldier drinking water, and a guy asked him how many slaves he owned. He said none. He goes, "Well, why are you fighting?" He said, "I'm fighting because you're down here."
Yeah, and that's very true. That's very true.
Let's say that, in your opinion, the Corwin Amendment gets passed and the war gets held off, or gets put off. How long do you think it would have took before the United States finally ended slavery? I mean, and what would it have taken? I mean, would it have taken them to pay off the aristocracies? I mean, surely we wouldn't have had it by by World War II. I mean, I just wonder how long it would have taken to finally end this.
That's a good question. And I don't know the answer, because I think that the South would have held on to slavery as long as they possibly could have, until the end of time, if possible. Had the North not intervened, with the war in trying to end it, I don't really foresee any end to it. Even though it was now illegal to import slaves from Africa, they had a very good concept of what it took in terms of breeding and making sure that there were always slaves available.
Oh yeah.
So, it was working for them. That's for sure. There were minor rebellions, and at this point, more and more blacks were learning to read, even though it was against the law. They were learning to do so. They were learning that there was life outside of the little plantation that they were on, that there were other areas that did not have slavery. And as they traveled back and forth, either with papers or with their master, they learned that there are places that I can go and not be recognized and not be seen. So you were starting to get some insurrections that were starting on plantations as it was. How long it would have taken for there to be a concerted effort to really make a plan to escape and to overtake, I don't know, because that would not have had to come just from one area. That would have had to come from several areas at one time. So I don't know that it would have happened anytime soon.
I think probably by the early to mid 1890s, I think there would have started been so much international pressure that would have been put on the United States that the United States would have came to some type of monetary compromise with the aristocracies. Like, look, we're going to have to pay you for this, and then work on getting the slaves away and setting them up. Because that's the only way I can see it without another war starting.
That's possible, but then still you have the government now telling the aristocracy what to do, which was the whole precept of the war, was states' rights. So I don't know that would have happened anytime.
If that scenario is, if they couldn't have worked out say, hey, look, we're going to pay you for this. Then maybe war was the only outcome to end it.
And I think it was. There was a lot of discussion before the president's office finally decided to declare war. They had a lot of pros and cons on, what will happen if we do it, if we don't do it. I think that there was a lot of thought behind actually going to war. Because when you go to war with another country, that's something different. But when you go to war internally with your own people, on your own country, in your own country, on your own lands, that's a pretty big decision. But I don't think that they saw any alternative to ending slavery other than cutting off the economic machine in the South. And the only way to do that was to go to war.
I mean, you may very well be correct on that. And, and some things just bother me, like Juneteenth or whatever it was when they delivered the message in Texas. It's kind of like, you write up and, hey, you've been freed. Now you're freed. And they're like, well, now what? Some of these people have been living, and like some of them left, like you said, but a lot of them have been on these plantations and couldn't read. Now what do they do? I mean,
and many of them stayed because where was there to go? I mean, you can tell someone that you're free, but unless you have a plan in place to help them truly become free, are they really free? No. I think about going to, we have a plantation not too far from me, just a couple hours, Orton Plantation, which is right outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. And that plantation was owned by the Moore, Moore, the Moore family. And when you go through the small town of Southport, most of the last names in that community are still Moore, because you can free a slave, but where is the slave to go if the plantation is all he's ever known? How is he to make a living if you give him nothing to start with? If he has no land, if he has no mules, money. If he has no grain, if he has no home, if he has no nothing. So many of them, fell into the system of sharecropping, stayed right where they were, and they're still there, to this day and time.
I mean, that's a lot in South Alabama, the Black Belt region. Sure. Is where they grew all the cotton. That was the wealthiest 11 counties in Alabama before the war. And now it's small counties, there's 35, 40,000 blacks in each one, but it was just, they've been there ever since and and just could never get out. And it's really sad, that happened. A friend of mine, his great-great-grandfather, he had a plantation, and I forgot how many slaves he had, but at the end of the war, it was, like we said, they had no place to go, so they stayed in sharecrop, and he wallpapered their rooms with Confederate money.
Well, that's about what it was worth. Actually, I probably got some wallpaper worth more than the money.
Probably so. But I mean, it was just, and another thing that bothers me too is, I mean, I know they had to eventually bring bring some federal troops out, but at the end of Reconstruction, they just abandoned these people and just left them on their own, and just they're still paying for, our nation is still paying for, 160 something years later, the way these people were just abandoned and left there with like that. I mean,
that's true. Freedom comes with a price. And that price is on both sides. You can free a person, but unless you've given him the tools to use that freedom, then basically it's a moot point.
I mean, it's just, I don't know. And then again, when I see that, why did it take, basically to the 1960s? Well, I guess the first civil rights plan was in 48, but why did it take, almost 70 years before they, something was done again? I mean, these people they couldn't vote, kept away from schools, didn't want to get educated, and our government, the federal government, just turned their back and just left these people on their own. And it's just really sad. Sorry, I guess we kind of got off on the United States colored troops there, and went on to something else. I didn't mean to take away from that, but I guess they kind of tied in, after Reconstruction and everything. And I wonder, though, I've often thought, what's your opinion, when Reconstruction started, and then all of a sudden you had, black senators and lieutenant governors and stuff. Do you think that played into some of the hatred that developed? Here, these guys were slaves a few years ago, and now they're the leaders.
Oh, absolutely it did. There was an awful lot of resentment toward that, which is why the Reconstruction period lasted a tenth as long as the Jim Crow period. And that's very true. And there were some blacks who did very well during Reconstruction. prime example, both of my grandparents were college graduates. My grandfather graduated from Xavier College in 1915. My grandmother
Wow.
graduated from New Orleans Normal School for Women in 1917. And those two schools eventually merged and became Xavier University. But as I said, my grandfather's mother, my great grandmother, whom I knew and born in 1859, had already been instituted at it was French, the Catholic Institute in New Orleans, as was her brother, who fought at Port Hudson during the Civil War. So there were instances of Blacks, and not just them, but, I think of my grandmother's graduation picture, of about 30 different women, who did take advantage of that Reconstruction period. But at the same time, there were still so many Blacks who were being held back, which led to the Great Migration in the 1920s. And
Right.
so many Blacks left the South, coming north, looking for education, looking for better jobs, looking for a better way of life for themselves and for their children.
I got a question for you, because I every year when it gets around this time, I forgot whatever it is, and the debate comes up. Holt Collier.
Okay.
Black Confederate guide or spy, or a young slave that was just taken along for the ride?
Probably a young slave taken along for the ride, but became so good at what he did. He did it on his own accord, as opposed to doing it for the cause of slavery. And I don't doubt that didn't happen. I don't doubt that it happened probably more than we know, or than has been written about. That's for sure. There were some very smart young Black men, and you have to ask, was my intention, or you have to ask, was their intention that if I do this, is this going to grant me freedom? If I do this, is this going to raise my standing within the plantation community after the war is over? Or if I do this, am I just going to be smart enough that I can eventually make my way to the other side of the line, and just gain my freedom on my own? So I don't doubt those circumstances, and probably did happen quite often. There were Blacks even before the war who were on plantations who were allowed to use guns, who would go out and hunt game to bring back to the plantation to cook. So they had gained skills. They had gained skills that were very useful during the war. And as I said, there's no doubt that there were probably instances of Blacks within Confederate units who were able to use those skills, and Black Confederates who very well utilized those skills. But in terms of an entire Black regiment being raised to fight, no.
When they passed the law or whatever, legend has it that there was 2 companies that was raised in Richmond. I've even heard reports that they were engaged at Sailor's Creek. I can't back that up or not. I don't even know if they was there. But even then, they were not promised freedom for being in the Confederacy. I was like, how can you not do that? And so I was curious one time. So I got to looking up the, when I keep hearing about the Confederate officers fighting for slavery. So I started looking up at the Confederate officers of slavery, and when I found out that the majority of them, except for the politicians, at the time of the war, had no slaves.
No.
Lee inherited some 57 that was supposed to be freed in 62. Jeb Stuart, Joseph Johnston, Longstreet. Hood's family had not had any in years. So the officers themselves, and what I've always said, the military and the political aspect, they fought differently. But I had read something one time, and I don't know if you've ever heard this. They said that General Ewell was the closest to an abolitionist in the South that you could find. And he told Jefferson Davis after First Manassas that you need to free the slaves and arm them, and Davis rejected them.
Yes.
And I never read that. I never heard that until a few months ago, and I found it. And they said he pushed it. Then we all know about Patrick Clayburn pushing it, but by then it was too late. But they said that Ewell was, and I didn't realize that Ewell was based almost an abolitionist, which would probably be not heard of for that time. But yeah, I thought it was really really interesting. And I don't understand why. Like I said, I don't understand why they've changed it to rewrite it where the Lost Cause where it wasn't about slavery, and like I said, just own it. But I found out some things that I'd like to ask you about because I don't want to keep you much longer. I've always heard somebody tell me they said stay away from the Southern Historical Society. It's a lost cause group. Well, I went in there and I started reading it, and there was some stuff, but then I found very interesting things that was historically backed up. About the war after action reports. Found some stuff in there, concerning Harriet Tubman's raid. That was in there. I mean, that was not lost cause stuff that people should really look into, because Harriet Tubman is probably one of my favorite. She was the first. Oh God, I love her. I mean, you don't know how much I admire her. Somebody a few years ago they posted something bad, or I posted the video where she did the slave raid, and some guy said, "So what?" And I ejected him because I'm such a fan. I mean, here it is. This is a black female in 1863 that is the first woman to lead an armed force. And she's one of my heroes. I'm sorry, I've talked too much. I should let you.
That's all right.
Talking. I just I love your side. I think it's great. Is there anything else that you'd like to add and tell us about, or any neat story that that you think everybody should hear?
I don't know. I mean, I've written so many stories. I can't really think of any one, that comes to mind right off the top of my head.
Well,
I don't know. It probably goes back to, and I remember the story of they called him Big Jack Johnson at Port Hudson. And I can probably relate to that story, as I said, because I've got family connections to that regiment, and they were fighting at Port Hudson, and he was just armed to the teeth. He's a big guy. I mean, you think about the height of most people back in the 1800s, and probably most of them average about 5'5", 5'6", and this guy stood about 6'4", and he was, built like an NFL player, that's for sure. But he fought at Port Hudson, fought to the tooth, and just led the people. He was not an officer, but he led that regiment, and he just told people just to keep coming. And finally, he was just literally slinging Confederates right and left, until finally he got to the top of that hill, and he was killed dead. But you could just kind of picture him, that great big black guy, just practically taking on an entire regiment on his own, and just serving as the centerpiece for that regiment. That was a good story. And I think about some of the black sailors, which don't get nearly the recognition.
And I didn't know about that the other day, that I was hearing about the black sailors.
Yeah, and I think about Richard Etheridge, and I live in North Carolina and spent a lot of time on the coast of North Carolina, and it was several years before we actually went to Manteo and went to the aquarium with our children when they were quite young. And as we were walking up, I realized that there were actually graves in the center of the walkway as you were coming up to the aquarium. And as I started to study that, the graves of Richard Etheridge and some of his surfmen who were from North Carolina, veterans of the Civil War, both on the Army side and on the Navy side, and became the predecessors of what is now the United States Coast Guard. And
oh my gosh!
Oh yeah, and about 10 years ago, the the U.S. Coast Guard named its first Coast Guard cutter after him, the USC Richard Etheridge. But I did not realize at the time that there are 3 state aquariums in North Carolina. And to honor his service, the state of North Carolina actually built that walkway around his graves as you go up to the aquarium, because he was pretty much the centerpiece of the Outer Banks in saving so many ships and so many sailors, and not only sailors, but just private boaters after the war.
God, that is a great story. Hey, if you're interested, and maybe once a month or whenever you get time, if you'd like to come on for like maybe another 20-minute show and just give a couple stories, I would love to hear that and post it on YouTube. Because I know you're a busy lady, and I'll just check in from time to time so you get through. Lucas Wilder's been coming on. We've been going over battles. We do about, I think last time about 30 minutes, but I think that'd be great. You come on and give 2 or 3 stories, and we'll post them and on the YouTube channel, and just get some of the stories out there for people that don't know this history. Because like I said, when I took Civil War classes, I never heard of it. I mean, never heard of the United States Colored Troops.
Yeah.
And it's just a story that needs to be told. I mean, I wish that I've been looking really hard for a group about the Native Americans that fought, and I can't find any Facebook groups on that, and I would love to get their story out. I just back during the it was I forgot what Confederate Memorial Day is. So I said, well, look, somebody said, are we going to do a Confederate Memorial Day? And I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, let's do this. And I had a day where one day was Confederate Memorial Day, one was USCT, one was Irish, one was female, one was Hispanics, one was Asians. I mean, Irish. I did something to honor everybody who participated in the Civil War. So that's just what I want to do. I mean, I want everybody's story to be told instead of just a bunch of white men.
That's very true. And there were Native Americans who fought on both sides. So, I think that would make a very interesting post.
Yes, and I would love to see that, and get to studying it more. I mean, because the last Confederate general was Stan Waite, who surrendered out there. And I mean, and you had Irish that fought on both sides. So, I mean, yeah, it would be great. One of the neat stories I found one time, and how this happened, I don't know. But there were 29 Chinese soldiers that fought for the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were Chinese, there were Hispanics, that fought on both sides too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there were people from every race, that's for sure. Yeah,
I mean, it was and I just love to get that out. I mean, just really everybody's story. But I know you've got to get back to your take care of your cows. I kept you a few minutes over, but I loved this, and I'll get it posted. And when I get up on YouTube, I'll get it into your group, and I'll check back with you in a few weeks and pick out maybe 3 or 4 stories, and we'll start having like a once-a-month show with stories of the USCT. If you're okay with that.
All right, that sounds like a plan.
Thank you, Miss Lee. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye. Bye.